Hi, my name is Andy Biggs. I'm a congressman from Arizona's 5th Congressional District. I'm joined today with a friend of mine and a special guest, Thomas Massie, congressman from Kentucky, and I'm going to read his bio. I think you'll be duly impressed. U.S. Representative Thomas Massie entered Congress in November 2012 after serving as Lewis County Judge Executive. What the heck's a Judge Executive, Thomas?
It's like the boss hog. Did you watch the Dukes of Hazzard?
I never did.
Okay, it's like the boss hog of a county. It's like the mayor, but of a county.
Just it's like the county I hear we'd call them county manager, something like that.
Yes, it'd be the county. So if you have a county commission, it's like the main commissioner, but it's a full-time job in Kentucky.
Okay. Well, Thomas represents Kentucky's 4th Congressional District, which stretches across northern Kentucky and 280 miles along the Ohio River. He attended the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I can't even say Massachusetts, where he earned a bachelor's degree in electrical engineering and a master's degree in mechanical engineering. During school, he invented a technology that enabled people to interact with computers using their sense of touch and leveraged that technology to found Sensible Technologies, Inc. The hardware and software he developed is now used to design automobiles, jewelry, shoes, dental prosthetics, and even reconstructive implants for wounded soldiers. In Congress, Thomas serves on 2 committees, the House Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure and the Committee on Oversight and Reform. And my friend Thomas is a lover of liberty, and he only votes incorrectly now and then when he doesn't vote with me. But he's generally great. Thomas, I'm so glad you serve in Congress and so glad to be with you today.
You know, you left out I'm chairman of the Mushroom Caucus because I like to say there's 435 members in the House, but only 4 or 5 of them know what's going on, and the rest of us are in the dark and being fed, fertilized. And most of the members of the Mushroom Caucus are so in the dark they don't even know they're a member. So that's
true.
I just went ahead and made myself chairman of this aforementioned caucus.
Well, what's interesting about that is there was an old science fiction movie called Logan's Run. Remember?
Yes.
They all lived in this bubble. They lived in a bubble till they turned 30 and then they got blown up. That's kind of like sometimes you might feel like you're in Congress. You're living in this bubble. So when we talk about a Washington, D.C. bubble, a lot of people think that's just that we're just disconnected with the rest of the country. But in reality, what it is we're disconnected with what's actually happening in that bubble, even in Congress much of the time, because right now, Nancy Pelosi, for instance, has made herself the sole dictator over the United States House of Representatives.
Yeah, you mentioned some of my inventions when I was at MIT. I was in the artificial intelligence lab working on virtual reality. And then I moved back here to Kentucky, and I got back to reality. But now that I'm in Congress, I tell people I got back into artificial intelligence and virtual reality. They're in that bubble in Washington.
Well, I am flattered that you would use the term intelligence, even if you're implying it's artificial. So that's fantastic. Hey, so let's talk a little bit about let's talk for a second about civil rights.
Sure.
And how they've been emasculated in the name of security, and that's contrary to what Franklin said, Jefferson said, other founders alluded to this, and other actually. Historians, et cetera, over time have talked about if you want freedom and security, you're not going to have either one. You're giving up one or the other. And what's your observations been? I mean, you've told me of some very anecdotal stories about what's happening in Kentucky.
Oh, wow, yeah. So the same week that our Democrat governor let 600 felons out of prison, he sent the state troopers around to photograph license plates of church members. So he said, if you go to church this Sunday, I'm sending out the state troopers to write down your license plates, and we're going to issue you a warning, then turn you into the local health department, and we'll start tracking you because you went to church. I think that's bad. I've told people that there's nowhere in the Constitution that authorizes the government to stick a needle in you against your will, or to track your location against your will, or to make you wear a face mask against your will. There's nowhere in the Constitution that authorizes that. And I would argue there's probably nowhere in the state constitutions that authorize that either. Because some people say, well, you can do it at the state level, but you're still taking away basic civil liberties when you do that. And finally, if you are going to construct some law that allows you to do that, you can't do it by executive order. There has to be a representative legislature, and then there has to be a court to adjudicate a lot of those things. And what we're seeing right now, I don't know how bad it is in Arizona, but in Kentucky, it's been pretty bad. Our governor's basically cribbing off of Mike DeWine in Ohio and Cuomo in New York. I wish he would copy more of Kristi Noem and Ron DeSantis, though.
Yeah, right. Well, so today there was a report out that a Republican state senator in Illinois has introduced legislation to allow the governor of Illinois to seize property, seize assets, and basically come after you where you live if you violate the governor's lockdown orders in his process for opening. So he might say, well, yeah, you have to do X, Y, and Z if you want to open your business. If you don't do it, this guy wants the governor to be able to seize your assets.
Well, I mean, every law eventually, when carried out to its absurd extent, involves taking you to jail and locking you in a cage if you don't comply. I mean, if you don't believe me, just start with the smallest law and break it, right? And then when you start not complying, you will end up behind bars. So, I guess that's one small twist. They'll just take your property in lieu of putting you behind bars in Illinois if they pass that bill. It's ironic or sad, I guess, that a Republican would introduce that in Illinois.
Well, it is. It's in my mind, it's terrible. But I've said this for a long time. The left, which always talks about trying to even out their notion of freedom, which is kind of a collective or communitarian type of notion of liberty, it always comes with authoritarianism, because you have to compel people to stop doing what they're doing, to allow the government to transfer wealth. It just seems the obvious conclusion when we went to lockdown, which, by the way, I think was a violation of our rights. It has to be done by force and compulsion, and that's what's inherent in leftism, whether it's socialism of some kind or other, which includes fascism and Marxian communism. So, what do you think? How do we stop this acquiescence to the removal of our rights in the United States today?
Well, a lot of people care about their neighbors, and a lot of people are patriotic, and they want to get through these tough times. And so they're wearing masks, they're staying at home. And the governors, I think some of these autocratic governors are taking that as a sign of compliance or acquiescence to their dictates and their edicts. But in reality, a lot of it is just people trying to do the right thing and exercise common sense. So let's just go back to that and let's let people do the right thing. I mean, one month you have the government telling you nobody needs to wear a mask, and then the next month you have the government telling you everybody needs to wear a mask. I mean,
you just touched a sore spot with me, Thomas. I fly in and out of Phoenix Airport at least twice a week, and for 2 months now, maybe 2/3 to half to 2/3 of people wear masks, and another third to half don't. And Phoenix just said, starting Monday, everybody must wear a mask, even if you just go in the airport. I'm like, okay, so really the so-called surge has already passed in Arizona, and now you're telling me I have to wear a mask? It not only is it absurd and authoritarian, the inconsistencies show you how crazy this authoritarian complex is.
It's worse than that. They are specifying masks that don't work, right?
Exactly.
And they're telling you, whatever you do, don't wear the mask that really has a filter small enough to stop the virus. Don't wear that mask, right?
Yeah.
Get you a pair of pantyhose or a handkerchief or a t-shirt and put it across your face, right? Like, and pray. It's like, just put your head between your legs and kiss your butt goodbye. I mean, that's about the same advice they're given. Sorry if I'm taking your podcast in a place you didn't want to go, but I had a dilemma last week when we were in Congress. I was sitting in the car about ready to go in to vote, and I had a mask, and I asked my wife, should I wear a mask in or not? And she said, well, why would you not? And I said, well, I think it's, in some ways, it's becoming a sign of oppression and compliance. And our governor mandated that you have to wear a mask now. And I don't know whether I should be projecting that compliance. And she said, well, he was very clear that you shouldn't wear an N95 mask. And I said, oh, so problem solved, because all I had was an N95 mask. So I took a Sharpie and wrote N95 on it and wore that into Congress. Because if we're going to tell people to wear a mask, why don't we explain to them which masks work?
Yeah. Well, and so this is a beautiful thing, because CDC now says you should wear a cloth mask. Okay. And yet the University of Minnesota, about a month and a half ago, put out a lit review. Did you see this? A lit review of all the studies of masks. And the only one that works is the N95 mask.
Yeah.
Everything else is virtue signaling.
Yes. And that's, or compliance signaling. Yes. So anyways, I solved the dilemma by wearing a mask that could actually feasibly work. As opposed to the virtue signal. And then I had people getting mad at me. Where'd you get that mask? And well, maybe some of us had a mask in our basement. Maybe some of us, like,
you're a prepper.
Yeah.
Thomas is a prepper, man. He's ready.
Also, if you work in your yard, if you wear an N95, right? Exactly. When I cut hay here in these fields that you see in the background, I wear an N95 because it works.
Right, and that's what I wear in my yard, which I've got a couple acres here, and my wife does most of the mowing, but I do have the pleasure of working there, doing other stuff and mowing. But I have bad allergies, so I wear that. You know, so what I find really bizarre about it is this notion that we're going to continue to get information from CDC and elsewhere. So you actually have I just want to point out two interesting conflicts. So number one, Dr. Birx said early on, probably 2 months ago, she said that she wants them to code every death as a COVID-19 if you even think that it's related. Not that it's causative or the proximate cause of the death, but if it caused a problem. So fast forward to about a week and a half ago, what she says at that point is, yeah, the CDC models, can't trust them. Can't trust them because they've overestimated the fatalities by at least 25%. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, that is, you start looking at it, it's bizarro. And then the other thing is the CDC, we could go on and on about the CDC, but the CDC today released this information, a study saying, well, you know, the infection fatality rate is far less than we thought. Mm-hmm. So you get conflicting information from the folks that are supposed to be in the know.
Well, they told us that herd immunity would come at when it's 80% were exposed to it, or either and contracted it symptomatically or asymptomatically, or 80% had the vaccine. But now they're saying open everything back up, and even the most conservative models say that fewer than 5% have contracted COVID-19. So what are they saying, Andy? They're basically saying they were wrong to start with when they shut everything down, because when they open things back up, 5% of the population having had COVID-19 is nowhere near herd immunity. Any model that applies when they open the economies back up now are basically the same models that applied in March when they shut everything down. except for maybe New York City, where you've got a whole different set of circumstances and probably a higher rate of infection. But here in Kentucky, it's like a rounding error, the number of people that contracted it. In my county here, there have only been 7 cases.
Wow.
So.
Wow. It has been crazy. You and I talked about, I want to say 3 weeks, a month ago, about basically the food supply chain. Everybody's been talking for a long time about the supply chain with China with regard to pharmaceuticals. But we know, I mean, Steve King, Congressman from Iowa, sent something out about 2 weeks ago, I believe, that he went to a pig farm where they were euthanizing literally thousands of hogs because there was no food processing available. And this is now Costco has said everybody's got to wear a mask. I don't know if you saw the video where the couple's trying to check out a Costco and the manager comes up and says, hey, you're not wearing a mask, so they get in this little back and forth. But anyway, Costco has said you get basically three cuts of meat that you get to buy because of supply. The restaurant I went to last night, they have a sign out saying we're having trouble with some of our food supply, so everything's $1 more because they got to pay a little bit more to try to get the food supply. So tell us about the food supply chain and the cascading effect of everything.
So I have a cattle farm here in the back, about 60 head of cattle. I raise beef cattle, not dairy. And when I have the time and the attention to do it, I direct market the beef to consumers locally here in Kentucky. And sometimes I get behind, I don't have time to direct market the beef, and I sell the cattle like most of my neighbors do at the auction house. Well, so that's my involvement in the whole food chain here. And it's given me a perspective that I've been warning about for 5 years. So here's the problem that we have today. Here's why you're seeing those shortages you're talking about and the prices increase. 4 corporations control 80% of the meat processing in this country. Think about that. 4 companies control 80% of the meat processing in this country. One of them is wholly owned by the Chinese, Smithfield. Another is called JBS, wholly owned by Brazilians. Okay, and then you got your multinationals rounding out the rest of the 4 companies. Well, when the COVID struck, it turns out a lot of their workers got sick. They work in close proximity, and so they shut some of these factories down, and some of them have reopened at reduced capacity because in order to reopen them, they had to space them further apart. And by the way, the president issued an executive order, invoked the Defense Production Act. And I think the reason he did that was to absolve these big factories of liability. If, let's say, a worker later claims that they've contracted COVID at work, then that claim won't be valid because of what the president did to give the factories some immunity from those claims and charges. But we still have a constricted processing capability, and people are asking, well, why are the farmers just euthanizing those hogs out in Iowa? By the way, Steve King says it's going to be between 3 million and 10 million hogs that are going to be euthanized. It's like 1 billion pounds of meat. Like, that's going to show up as a deficiency in the supermarkets and in the restaurants. In fact, I have a restaurateur here in my district. She's got 8 employees. She sends them all to Sam's Club every day because they can each buy 2 briskets, right? Or 2 pieces of meat. And she needs enough meat to serve her customers. So she's turned them into straw purchasers. It's like some illicit gun deal or something, right? She's turned them into straw purchasers just so she can get enough. I don't know.
Look, I got some brisket in my trunk. I'll sell you.
Yeah, right. Actually, that's me, Biggs. I'm going around the district with brisket, trading brisket for votes. There'll be some meat scandal. Anyways, I don't do that. And I've never contemplated it until just now. But in any case, so here's the solution, Andy, and you're a co-sponsor of the bill. I believe you were a co-sponsor of this bill before the epidemic.
Yes, I was.
Yeah, because you and I talked about this. Okay, there's parallel meat processing capability here in the United States. There's the four big packers, and then there's some smaller but also big packers. And then you've got these custom slaughterhouses, they're called, where let's say you shoot a deer or an elk, you can take your animal there and they'll slaughter it for you. But that's not the predominance of their business. Most of their business is butchering a cow for a family. So a family goes either wholly or on partial ownership with another family, and they purchase a cow from a farmer and then have it butchered there, and they fill up their freezer. Okay, those small shops, those small custom slaughterhouses, and they're called custom because they'll cut whatever you want, right? You bring in an animal, you say, I want the T-bones, or I want the
All ground meat, whatever.
yeah, the filet, I want chuck roast, or I want ground beef. Yeah, so they're custom. They are inspected, but they don't have a full-time USDA employee. And there are a few other things they may not check the boxes off of. So they can't sell that meat in the supermarket or at restaurants. The only way they can sell you beef is if you go buy it from the farmer and you buy like half of an animal. That's very regressive, particularly with a lot of people who are out of work. Let's say they go to Costco, the price is doubled and they can only get 2 packages, right? Well, if they go to the local butcher, the local slaughterhouse, he's going to say, well, I'm going to have to sell you half the animal.
Right.
That's like, okay, 1,000-pound steer is going to yield 500 pounds of meat. Half of that's 250 pounds. If you were to pay an average of $10 a pound, that would be $2,500 of meat, but let's say it's half that. So it's about $1,250 of meat. How many people can afford to buy $1,250 of meat?
And the freezer that they're going to need to put it in.
And the freezer they got to put it in, and then pray that the electricity doesn't go out for more than a couple days ever, because then you're going to have the biggest barbecue the neighborhood ever saw, right? Don't ask me how I know about those situations. But anyways, so what the bill would do that you and I have sponsored, it's called the PRIME Act, Processing Revival, Intrastate Meat Exemption. Okay. Nobody knew we needed a processing revival until the last few weeks when they go to Costco and they can only buy 2 and the price is doubled, and in some cases you can't get the cuts you want. But now they know we need a processing revival. It would allow a consumer to buy meat in their own state through a facility that's not, quote unquote, full-time USDA inspected, although they are inspected by the health department and state inspections. It would allow them to buy the meat by the cut instead of by the animal. And people say, wait, is that safe? Is that safe? Well, Andy, it's the safest meat you will ever find because, number one, you know the processor and you know the farmer. There's accountability. Number two, when you go to a fast food store, that hamburger you eat may have 600 different animals in it. Like they're all the same, they're all cattle, right? But it may be 600 different cattle in that hamburger. And every time you add another animal to the mix, you exponentially, as you get to 600, increase the probability that you've introduced some form of E. coli or something that's not good. By the way, I'm not trying to scare people.
You're turning people into vegans is what you're doing now, Tom.
No. Well, I buy hamburgers at Wendy's and McDonald's too. So there's a spot for that food supply, okay? But I think it's much safer, the food that you get locally. By the way, my family for 15 years has been eating the beef that's processed at the local processor. And nobody that I know of ever who's bought half a cow or a whole cow and put it in their freezer has ever gotten sick from that, ever.
Yeah. And Thomas, we used to raise a cow every year, have it butchered for us. Maybe sell a quarter of it, to a family or member or friend. Always fine. And you know what else? I knew what was going into that cow.
Oh yeah. You can also know how the workers have been treated at that processing facility because they're your neighbors. You can talk to them at the Dollar General store, right? Or when you go to the processing facility, a lot of them will let you look in the back. They got nothing to hide. And you also know how the animals are being treated. They're not raised behind, 20-foot tall walls or in buildings that you have to would sneak into to find out. They're growing in a field like this back here. And you can go see, does this farmer treat his animals well? Yeah. So anyways, that's what our bill would do. It would allow, as long as you don't try to cross state lines, and this gets to the constitutional aspect of the bill. It's very firmly grounded in the Constitution. As long as the farmer, the processor, the grocery store, and the consumer are all in the same state, and that animal never, or the beef from it, or the pork from it, or the lamb from it, never enters into interstate commerce, then the USDA, frankly, has no authority to be involved in that transaction.
Yeah, no, that's right. I mean, people have seen the Commerce Clause abused and stretched beyond all recognition for the last 100 years, and maybe even a little bit before that. But I mean, if you're intrastate, then it's state regulators and not federal regulators.
And
I just want to speak to that for a second, because that's one aspect of the bill I really like. Because we're talking about the food supply chain, but I think we're also talking about the constitutional upside down pyramid that we're in today, where it used to be thought, and we were talking about this before we came on, is that the federal government was very small, limited rights. I mean, if you look at Madison's original writings and the other founders, they're all going to talk about, well, yeah, the federal government has very limited, enumerated, specified rights, and their main job is to protect the citizens' rights and the states' rights, and then we've got these duties here we think will help us do that, and it's completely upside down now, where the states are treated as, if you will, subsidiaries of a national government instead of sovereign entities relationally to a federal government.
Although now the governors, some of these Democratic governors are finding the 10th Amendment in their Constitution now, that they want to infringe on your rights and shut things down. They forgot about the 14th Amendment.
Exactly right.
And they're wanting to run roughshod. By the way, Andy, this is a bipartisan bill. This is not there's no ideological divide on this bill like you see on a lot of bills in Congress. We are now up to 9 Democrat co-sponsors in the House on this bill. And one libertarian, Justin Amash, our friend Justin, is a co-sponsor. So we've got
some of those votes he's taken lately. I think maybe he's got to hand in his libertarian card.
I'm not going to diss on a co-sponsor. Anyways.
No. I love Justin, but still.
There's 3, and also he ups the nonpartisanship of this bill, because there are 3 different party affiliations on this bill in the House. And then in the Senate, the lead sponsor is none other than Angus King of the Prime Act, right?
Wow.
It's almost like he was elected to sponsor this bill with a name like Angus King.
Absolutely. That's
so
good.
And he caucuses with the Democrats. Now there's several other senators, Hoeven and Daines from, Hoeven and Kramer, I'm sorry, from North Dakota are both sponsors. And then Blackburn and Alexander from Tennessee, both senators, are sponsors. And Rand Paul is a sponsor. So there's several sponsors in the Senate too. But the reason I'm telling you about all the sponsors is, what do you call a bill that has 4 different party affiliations, right? We've got independent, libertarian, Republican, and Democrat. It's obviously not bipartisan. It's quadpartisan or polypartisan, but I think we've set a new record here for working across the aisle.
You got to call it polypartisan, because that's what I think that anything above 2 these days is going.
Well, you did.
So tell me some more about the food supply chain shortage, because I think it's going to have, what we're talking about is you have a hose, and what's happening is there's a crimp at the process, but there's going to be a cascading effect as we go.
Yes, it's almost like another analogy is a slinky. Okay,
Okay.
everything's bunched up at the processor right now, and the wave can't propagate through there. But farmers are acting in the only way they can. They're euthanizing their animals, right? But there's something else that's going on at the farms that people need to know about. The farmers are saying, wait, this problem could be around for a while, so I'm not going to breed back the sows. Okay. Now, it takes, after a hog is born, a piglet is born, it takes 6 months for that hog to be slaughter ready. And what I'm telling you is you can't work 3 shifts in a factory and make a hog overnight. Like, it doesn't work like other parts of the economy. Biology is different. So the farmers are making decisions today that will affect the market 6 months from now in the hog market. In the chicken market, it takes 21 days to hatch an egg and 8 to 12 weeks to raise the bird to slaughter age. So you're working with about 3 months there because they're destroying eggs at the hatchery instead of putting them into the meat, into the chicken houses that would become part of the meat supply. And in the dairies, and I witnessed this myself when I took 2 of my steers to a facility 2 or 3 weeks ago. The dairies, some of them are slaughtering their dairy cows and turning them into hamburger. So I was at this facility. It's a USDA facility. It's somewhere between the giant facilities and the small non-USDA facilities. It's a USDA facility that's in the middle, and I would love to use them more, but they're 3 hours from my house. And there's only a few of those. If you live close to one, you won the lottery if you're a farmer. There's so few of them in existence. But I took my steers there, and I saw these dairy cattle. Now, there's a certain amount of dairy cattle that go into the beef supply normally, like the old dairy cows when their production goes down. But this dairy cow, I wanted to put this in my trailer and bring it home. I don't have a milk cow yet, right? This thing needed milk. It was full of milk. It looked vibrant, not that old. And what I realized was the dairies that have been pouring out the milk, look, they can't afford to keep feeding cattle and pouring out the milk. At some point, they got to quit feeding the cow. And if you're going to quit feeding the cow, you can't let it starve. You turn it into a hamburger. And at that point, it takes 3 years, to replace a dairy cow, right? It has to be conceived. It's like 9 months to gestate. It's got to be about 2 years old before it can have its first calf, which is when it gets its first milk. I mean, you're 3 years away from replacing that cow. So this big slinky, right now, the bottleneck, there was another bottleneck too, Andy. There was the restaurants, when that demand went away. The packaging.
And they were like 40% of the market.
That's right.
And also, what really complicated that too, Thomas, is that they get their food in bulk. So
Yes.
So for instance, if we happen to have an egg ranch here in the valley, 7 million eggs a day, something like that. Well, they're big enough they can flip the switch. So what the eggs that they were doing, where they were pre-mixing eggs and selling them in the bag within the box, for restaurants, they could switch that to cartons with a flip of the switch. They just go to the egg cartons.
Right.
Most egg producers or egg processors can't do that. And so if you're processing for restaurants, you can't do that anymore. So they go out.
Right.
Same thing with everything else.
So that crimp, the fact that the type of demand changed, caused some of the farmers to rationally respond and lower their ability to produce, right, and their future ability to produce. So I think here's the gist of all of this, Andy. You've got people going out in the news and saying, "Oh, this is all temporary. The shortages are temporary. The blah blah blah." No, you're going to have shortages, higher prices, and imported meat from and dairy, more of that from other countries for the next 6 months to a year. I am predicting. Now, nobody's going to starve. There will always be enough food to eat. But the selection that you had before is not going to be the selection that you have going forward. and the prices are going to be higher. So get used to it until and unless we pass the Prime Act, and that will ameliorate some of this. Now, the Prime Act is not a silver bullet. There currently aren't enough small processors to meet all of this demand. I talked to a small processor last night. He's backed up till February of 2021. So, and he's not even a USDA facility. But in order for him to expand, to invest in the equipment, to expand, he needs to know that there's going to be a market later on after this bolus passes through. And for that market to exist later on, we need to pass the Prime Act. And I've had small processors, people who used to be in the business, tell me, you know what, I got out of it, but if you pass the Prime Act in 5 weeks, I can be up and running. So
That's great.
I think we need to pass it, and I think it needs to be permanent law, not some temporary allowance, from the USDA, because if it's temporary, people aren't going to make the investments.
Exactly right. It's all about incentives, Thomas. You know that, and the incentive is not high enough if you know that 6 months from now, after you've expended the investment resources, the capital, that they can come and say, well, we've changed our mind. We're going to go back.
Right.
So it should be done legislatively. So with that in mind, how is that faring? I mean, how many committees did you get that thing assigned to, and how's it going?
Well, here's an interesting thing, Andy. Last Congress, the chairman of the Ag Committee, well, he wasn't the chairman last Congress, Colin Peterson.
Yeah.
He was a sponsor of this bill last Congress. Now he's the chairman, and I'm trying to get him to sponsor it again. I think he's he's probably generally a reasonable person if he's sponsored it before. I think what I'm saying is he's not totally against this bill. What I'm saying is there's a chance, right? You've seen the memes. So what you're saying is there's a chance. Now, the Republican ranking member is not for this bill. And I won't question another member's motives. But there are a lot of strong forces in Washington, D.C. that oppose this bill. And let me tell you one objection that I've heard. At the USDA, I've talked to the USDA. I've talked to the people that work directly for Sonny Perdue on these issues. Right. They're not for my bill. They don't want to give up any control. In fact, they were denying there's any problem. Now they're helping farmers euthanize their animals. But when I was telling them there's a problem, they were denying there's a problem. So I got to call them back and ask them if they think there's a problem yet. But one of the objections they raised is that the World Trade Organization and the U.S. Trade Representative won't like this bill because they're saying if we reduce the regulations on our own farmers, that the other countries who try to export their farm products to our country will say that we have engaged in an unfair trade practice, and that a trade war, some trade dispute will ensue, and the WTO would rule against us. I know your listeners' eyes are glazing over or their blood is boiling, one of the two things, because that to me is not putting America first. When you're saying, nope, we got to keep this monopoly of the Chinese and the Brazilians processing all our food, because otherwise we'll tick off the Chinese and the Brazilians, or the other countries. For goodness sakes, Andy, if we're euthanizing millions of viable animals that should have been in the supermarket and causing some families to go without in this country, I think it's time to get back to our senses and relook at these trade deals and do what's right for our farmers and our consumers.
Yeah, and Thomas, I'll tell you, and I don't know where you are. I think you're where I am. That's why I've always been opposed to multilateral trade agreements.
Amen. Amen.
If you have a one-off with another country, then you can make adjustments. You can
be
more accountable. You can give them adjustments when they need to have adjustments, and you can protect your national interests. But when you do these massive multilateral arrangements, man, it's really you're at somebody's beck and call.
While we're on the topic of beef and we're talking about multilateral trade agreements.
Yeah.
When did you get elected to Congress, Andy? Was it 2016?
Yeah.
Okay. So you weren't complicit in this, and I think you would have been on my side. But Congress removed country of origin labeling for beef and pork in 2015. And the argument that we were given was that the World Trade Organization told us to do it. And if we didn't do it, that other countries would retaliate on our other products like corn and soybeans. And the argument they used in the World Trade Organization, by the way, I think it was the big meat packers that put these other countries up to suing the United States and the World Trade Organization. Conspiracy theories are unnecessary when unenlightened self-interests are at work. Well, I think it was a bunch of unenlightened self-interests who put these other countries up to suing us because what they wanted to do was buy piglets and calves from other countries, bring them to the United States, raise them in the same pens and corrals as the U.S. animals, and then sell them at the supermarket without differentiating them. And it was the big meat packers that wanted the lower priced animals from the other countries to be here. And if you label everything, then there's a stigma associated with the stuff that's not labeled from the United States. Anyways, if you go to the supermarket, your fish is labeled, country of origin labeled. Your fruit is labeled. Go to the hardware store. Your tools and the hardware are labeled. Go to the Apple store. Your iPhone is labeled. But what is no longer labeled?
Your shirt's labeled, Thomas.
Your shirt's labeled, yeah. I'm afraid to even look. And then your beef and pork is not labeled because of that law change. And it was all
chicken too, if I'm not mistaken. Is chicken?
Chicken is still labeled. They tried to get it in there. It was in a version that the House passed. And then that bill didn't pass the Senate, so they threw it into one of these omnibus bills. And when they did the omnibus bill, they took the chicken part. So chicken is still labeled, I believe. But I'm just telling you, this was a result. I went digging, and I'm like, what was the trade agreement? It was GATT. It wasn't even NAFTA. It was GATT that caused all this to precipitate and caused us to give up our sovereignty and to make the wrong decision for consumers and farmers in this country.
Well, just a couple points on that. Number one, I have a constituent who's very adamant about we should be labeling everything even more than we do now. And the reason being is the concern is China. China's doing some very interesting things. So, for instance, on the chicken, one of the things that I found out is that they will pre-process in China, and then they'll send it over here for finished processing, since there is labeling.
Uh-huh.
So they'll send it over for finished processing, so you say it's processed in the U.S. Well, that's interesting, but it's not very much, by the way. That's a very, very small portion of the poultry distributed in this country, but that's pretty interesting in and of itself. But what you talked about that I think is important is an omnibus bill. So I have a piece of legislation out there that gets at one subject, one bill. It's a law, to make it a law, because rule changes haven't worked. It's something that Mia Love had for a while. Somebody before her had it. Somebody before that person had it. But the omnibus bill, I mean, that's when you get things like a $2.2 trillion package nobody has time to read, that gives you everything from voting rights. You expand it any way you can, and you give policy and procedure in there, and it just, nobody even knows what's there, but people feel compelled to vote for it for whatever reason. And then we do another one. So that, I think, if I have my wish, that bill would pass. I think the 60 vote rule in the Senate is incredibly detrimental. You know what I always hear? Can I just talk about this for a second? Just as long as I'm rambling.
Wait. Let me be in violent agreement on your first bill, okay? And because I'm pretty sure I'm a co-sponsor. I remember co-sponsoring it when Mia Love was the sponsor.
Yeah,
in fact,
we'll get you on.
Okay, put me on it if I'm not already. In fact, though, did you notice Nancy Pelosi's $3 trillion bill was called the HEROES Act?
Oh, yeah.
And so I'm always interested to see, what does the acronym stand for? So I look at the HEROES Act, okay? The O is omnibus and the S is solution. And Andy, I maintain, and I think your bill does too, that the words omnibus and solution should never appear in the same sentence, much less the same bill, because the omnibus is the problem, not the solution.
Yeah, no, Thomas, that's exactly right. You see it at state level. In Arizona, we have a single subject rule. Most states have a single subject rule for their legislation, and still we get around it. But you know what? You really have to justify it. You have to at least fight harder to make it clear, and it's a little bit more transparent in the process. But the other thing that just drives me to death is the 60-vote rule in the Senate. So the 60-vote rule in the Senate, basically, to get a bill passed, you really got to have 60 votes. I won't get into the weeds on it, but here's the funny part about it. You can ask anybody in the Senate. I ask people, say, well, why do you want to keep the senators? Why do you want to keep the 60-vote rule? Because it protects the minorities' rights. Now, we want to protect minority rights, but you know what we are? We are a majoritarian country. The majority rules. If you didn't have the more votes than your opponent, guess what? You win. You would lose because you didn't have enough votes. You couldn't come in and say, well, you should have won with a super majority to protect my rights, because I could only muster up 49.99%. That's not right, and that is the problem I see with the 60-vote rule, and they use it as a sword and a shield in the Senate.
Well, man, I've gone this far in your podcast without disagreeing with you. I don't want to turn it into a debate, but let me tell you what I agree with you on first. I agree with you on political appointments, that it shouldn't require 60 votes to get to a political appointment. Because that you're not creating a new position, you're filling a position with somebody, right? You're not growing government. But for any bill that grows government or spends money, I would like to have a 99 vote rule in the Senate. I want to make it harder to grow government or spend money. And so I am actually okay with the 60 vote rule. And I know we could go back and say, well, the founders never intended to have a supermajority. The founders never intended for you to vote for a senator. The senators, until the 17th Amendment, were named by their states. And I would love to go back to that and then get rid of your 60 vote rule. But until the senators start working for the states again, instead of being Santa Claus, But
here's the thing. And I agree with you. I don't want to turn it into a debate either, because I agree with your sentiment, because I think you're right, but I want to be a little bit more nuanced if I can. You have a right. We have a right to say on any spending bill, we're going to require a supermajority. But when you require that on every bill, you know what you've done? You've diluted my representation, because now instead of having the rights of the majority, I now don't have the rights of the majority. I'm relegated to perhaps some kind of weird in-between land where I am now thrown into the minority because we can't get a supermajority. Anyway, we can talk about this offline there.
Well, here's the thing. Here's the thing, though. Maybe you'll agree with me on this, Andy. The House is so screwed up, and Pelosi is making the rules so much worse.
Yes.
That we probably got better things to worry about than how the senators conduct themselves, right? If we could solve the problems in the House, the way this republic is set up, you have to have concurrent majorities, not one majority. It doesn't take, Nancy Pelosi can't do something on her own. Donald Trump can't do something on his own. The Supreme Court can't do something on their own. Every majority has to line up the way, if we were working under the constitutional framework as it was established, yes, you have to have concurrent majorities for it to work. And you and I need to worry about what's going on in the House right now. And they are bastardizing the rules in the House, in my opinion. like on this proxy vote.
Yeah.
Uh, and
No, I agree with you at least that far, Thomas. We've got plenty of work to worry about in the House. But since I'm having to shelter in place because Nancy Pelosi won't bring members of Congress back in, sometimes I do get to ponder and reflect upon the upper chamber, ostensibly the upper chamber. But look, the proxy voting. So let's explain the proxy voting. A lot of people get confused with remote voting and proxy voting. Remote voting is something different, something that I think you may be comfortable with. I don't know if I'm comfortable with it yet or not, but it's where you can at least see everybody and you can actually verify that they're there and you can have the debate, whatever it is. But proxy voting is something different. It's basically saying 20 people can show up with basically a power of attorney, declare that they've got a quorum, and then run the House.
You mean like what was going to happen on March 27th until I stood up and said you have to have a quorum, like this was the first time CNN ever reported the news correctly. They said I was the most hated man in Washington D.C.
I didn't hate you.
I didn't say you did. I know I'm more of a squish.
Right. You were everybody's piñata at that point. And everybody's taking a swing at you.
Except there's no candy in me. They were just beating me up for the fun of it. But
and then what happened is the next time people at what they asked for.
They showed up for work, and number one, they came, we voted, they asked for a recorded vote, and we had it. And then this last week, Nancy Pelosi, after calling me a dangerous nuisance, after saying the blood would be on my hands on March 27th, because I insisted that we have a quorum show up to pass a bill, the biggest spending bill in history, what does she do? She calls everybody into Washington, D.C. for a fake bill, a bill that's her dream list. The only thing it didn't have was restocking her freezer with ice cream there in San Francisco. And she gets us to show up to vote on a pretend bill, and after blaming me for being reckless, for asking half of Congress to be present in order to pass a real bill.
Yeah.
So anyways, so the proxy vote, let me tell you the problem I had with the proxy vote, because I could be for remote voting. I think remote voting is better than everybody staying home and letting Nancy Pelosi pass stuff by unanimous consent. Okay?
I agree with that.
Which was what was about to happen on March 27th. Okay. So I've taken a position that remote voting is better than unanimous consent and nobody in the chamber, and nobody even remote voting. But this proxy voting, there are a couple problems I have with it. Number one, if you read how it's written, it says that the House physician shall declare that there's a pandemic and then tell the sergeant at arms, the House sergeant at arms. And by the way, I've never met the House physician as far as I know. The House sergeant at arms seems like a decent guy, but he's been there for 5 or 6 speakers, right? If there's a deep Congress, he's it, okay? So you got the House physician, the House sergeant at arms will go up to the speaker under these new rules and tell Madam Speaker, there's a pandemic and it's time to invoke proxy voting. And then Madam Speaker waves a wand and now we're proxy voting. How do you do that? We should have, again, and here's where a supermajority, I think, you might disagree with me, but we do pass bills on a supermajority in the House sometimes if the debate has been shortened. We say, okay, this is a non-controversial bill, and so we're not going to debate it. But in order for this bill to pass without debate and under all the rules being suspended, we got to have 2/3 vote. I think we should, if you're going to do proxy voting or remote voting in times of emergency, which is the only time it should be appropriate, it should take, in my opinion, a 2/3 vote to either invoke the proxy or / remote voting, or in order to pass that bill. If the bill rises to the importance that we can't be there and it still needs passed, then I think there should be some kind of supermajority requirement there. But in any case, the bill, the way they wrote it, gave Nancy Pelosi more power. By the way, I didn't vote for Kevin McCarthy to be speaker. I didn't vote for John Boehner to be speaker. I didn't vote for Paul Ryan to be speaker. I'm like, I've never voted for a speaker that's become speaker. And I sure as hell didn't vote for Nancy Pelosi. So it's like, I don't care who the speaker is. I don't want to give them more power. Every speaker I've ever been under in the House of Representatives starts acting like a dictator.
Well, your points are well taken. I'm really concerned. I know you saw that 2 days ago, Nancy Pelosi invoked the proxy vote for the FISA bill this coming week. And so she's triggered it with the Sergeant at Arms letter. I got a copy of the Sergeant at Arms letter. It was just ridiculous. And she's arrogated power to herself. And with us not being in DC, in my opinion, there's absolutely no pressure on her to include even her own conference in drafting this stuff. It's just whatever she thinks she can get by with in a way, and then she counts her votes.
Yeah.
Well, Thomas, thanks, man, for giving me the time. It's always good to talk to you. It's just one of the most interesting guys in Congress. I didn't even mention how many patents you have. How many patents do you have now, Thomas?
30 now, and I filed one recently for something I can't talk about. So super secret. But it's going to help farmers and consumers get healthy food, and it's a farm automation deal.
I believe I saw that. I think you showed it to me. So.
Yes, I did. I showed you a video, but you're sworn to secrecy, even if we weren't in a skiff.
I haven't told anybody, so I mean that's
okay.
Well, anyway, best of luck to you and your family, Thomas. Beautiful Kentucky. Maybe one day again it will be beautiful, free Kentucky, and
instead of Kentucky Stan.
I'll see you next week in Congress, man.
All right, I look forward to seeing you, Andy.